welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was born sometime between 1504 and 1509. We are going to go with 1509 because we don't know, and that's my best guess. Her birthday wasn't recorded because what do girls need birthdays for, right? It seems silly that something so important wasn't written down. But if you think about it, my mother probably wouldn't have written down my birth date if the hospital hadn't done it for her. Some people need a little extra push to keep records. At the time of her birth, she likely had 4 older brothers, John 11, Edward 9, Henry 6, and Thomas 1. You would think that the birth of your first daughter would be worth writing down, but she wasn't a boy. The year of her birth was likely the same year that Queen Catherine married the teenage King Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn was just a little 8-year-old girl at the time. Jane was born into gentry class. Her parents weren't noble, but they were wealthy for non-nobles. Their family was old money. They had come to England with William the Conqueror, nearly 450 years earlier. Anne Boleyn was Jane's second cousin because everyone in England was related at the time. Their mothers were cousins. The Seymour family resided at Wolf Hall. Her father was John Seymour. John was a knight and sometimes a sheriff, a justice of the peace, and a constable. He was a keeper of the peace, rubbing shoulders with the nobles. Jane's mother was Marjorie Wentworth. As a girl, she was placed in a position in the household of her aunt, the Countess of Surrey, where she met the poet John Skelton, whose muse she became. She was considered a great beauty by Skelton and others. In poetry dedicated to her, he praised her demeanor. Skelton's poem, Garland of Laurel, in which 10 women, in addition to the Countess, weave a crown of laurel for Skelton himself, portrays Marjorie as a shy, kind girl, and compares her to Primrose and Columbine. Jane was not highly educated. Her and her siblings had been educated at home, which was unusual for the time. They had a wealthy, but kind of a country down-home life. She could read and write a little bit, but academics weren't a high priority for a girl of her station. She was much better at needlework and household management, which were considered far more important knowledge for women of that time. Her needlework was reportedly elaborate and beautiful. She was also said to really enjoy hunting and horseback riding. Jane was a country girl. On paper, Jane fit the beauty standards of her day. She was an English rose, light skin, light hair, light eyes. But she doesn't seem to have been beautiful or necessarily charismatic. She's kind of known as plain Jane. She was also known for being not so intelligent, but that last part I wholeheartedly disagree with. The Seymour family had some in-house drama. All rumors, but rumors that we know about today, so 500-year-old rumors. They persisted through time. Jane Seymour had an older brother named Edward. Edward was married to Catherine. This is a dynamic that we've talked about a few times. Catherine was from a wealthy family and had no brothers, so she was due for a rather large inheritance when her father died. But when her father died, he had written both her and her children with Edward out of his will. The will was contested by Edward, claiming that his father-in-law had been mentally unwell. It appears Catherine's father thought that Catherine got around. He even questioned the paternity of her children, though that was an easy accusation to make about a woman back then and not so easy to prove wrong. Catherine ended up leaving her marriage after the scandal and became a nun. Word on the street was that she had been sleeping with her father-in-law, making Edward's 2 sons really his half-brothers. We have no idea if this rumor is true, but at the time people believed it. Even Edward thought that his children weren't his. But he could have just been bitter that he didn't get the money. So his first wife was a nun, and he remarried and had a new set of children with that wife. Jane became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine as early as 1527, when she was about 16. This was a prestigious appointment for Jane, but not as prestigious as it had once been. During this time, Henry had started to move on from his first wife, the Queen. He had started to show intense interest for one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Anne was a very different kind of lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Anne was older, in her 20s at this point. She was outspoken, well-traveled, and highly educated. Jane was a quiet, sheltered, and shy teenager. Jane was the second cousin of Anne Boleyn, living in her shadow a little bit. This would have been her environment in the latter part of her formative years. She likely would have felt for the Queen. Having been left by her husband, she was on the Queen's side. She would have seen that he was not open to having only one daughter, and she would have likely related to that. She was very much a girl of her time. Girls just weren't as important as boys. There were two queens' courts. Catherine was looking for quiet, polite Catholic ladies. She was running not a party court. She was very strict with her ladies, so I think this tells us something of the personality of Jane. The other was Anne Boleyn's court. Lively, lots of music and plays and parties. Henry spent his time at Anne's court, so Jane wouldn't have spent a lot of time with the king. Queen Catherine was banished from court in 1531. King Henry was running out of patience with his wife, and he wanted her gone. The now 22-year-old Jane, it seems, went with her, supporting her through the legal fight with the king. At 22, it was getting to the point when people were wondering why Jane wasn't married. 30 is the new 22. 22 in the 16th century was roughly when women started to think seriously about getting married, having babies. Like, if you want kids, you should at least be looking for a husband by your 20s. And still, at 24, she was single. Not only single, but no one, it seemed, had shown any interest in her at all. This is likely where her reputation of plain Jane came from. But there were a lot of reasons this could have been. First of all, her oldest brother's wife had been accused of sleeping around and sent to a nunnery. Not because she had been caught in the act, but because she was seen to be friendly with men. This happened in Jane's formative years. It would have made an impact. It could have been money troubles. Maybe her father wasn't offering a grand dowry. And she had a lot of brothers, so money would not have been a reason to marry her. She was not going to get an inheritance. It was dowry, and that's it. But her younger sister was married, so it wasn't just that. She was at court attending Queen Catherine, who wouldn't have approved of flirting as a pastime. She served Catherine at the same time as Anne Boleyn, so they would have known each other. Bare minimum, they were co-workers, and Anne flirted her ass off. As we know, that is how she caught the attention of the king. When Anne built her own court, the ladies-in-waiting were to some degree split up. Most of Catherine's ladies stayed with her, but if they were particularly close to Anne or really wanted to live in a more liberal court, they would have gone with Anne. Jane stayed with Queen Catherine, telling us which one she preferred. There were also the hats. This seems like not a determining factor, but it had to at least have partially mattered. Queen Catherine had always worn the English gable hood. It was the traditional headdress in England for noble and royal women. Google it if you can. It was stiff and structured. It kind of looked like a small house with a pointed roof that you would wear on your head as a hat. And it had fabric in the back that would cover your hair, and it would be split into two like a split-tail jacket of a fancy suit. And it had fabric in the front that would cover your hairline. Your hair didn't show at all. Anne, having grown up primarily in France, wore the French hood. Again, Google it if you can. The best I can describe it is like a big, puffy, thick headband. There was no fabric in the front, so your hairline could be seen, and that was seen as risque. Like, ooh, you can see her hair. I don't know. It also had cloth veil in the back, but it didn't split. It was just one solid piece that covered your hair. Like, hair in the front was enough. Like, see the front little hairline and get all hot and bothered. Can't see any more of that hair. The same way that men signaled loyalty with the naming of their sons, the women started signaling their loyalty with the kinds of hats they used to cover up that sexy, sexy hair. Keep in mind that when you think about Jane Seymour's sister-in-law's marriage issues, hair was like cleavage. Showing a man uncovered hair would be like walking in fully topless now. If you weren't wearing a hat, it was scandalous. It didn't take much to get her reputation, is what I'm saying. Back to English court, there were two sides. It was like shirts and skins, English hats or French hats. It would be like you were offered two jobs. The same job, in most respects, but for one, the dress code was business, and for one, the uniform was the uniform from Hooters. It would really just depend on what you would feel more comfortable in, because the job was essentially the exact same thing. Jane was a conservative country girl at court. She was serving her queen in a time when the queen was very popular with the people, but not popular with her husband, the king. During this time, someone began showing interest in Jane. She was 24 at the time, and that was seen as older to start a family. A lot of girls had their first couple of babies when they were still teenagers. She was getting to an age where she had to get married or become a nun. Maybe she was waiting for love? William Dormer was interested in a match with Jane. But William's parents were like, nope, not happening. Not her. So Jane went back to no courtship. He was the only man who had shown interest in her. She probably wasn't feeling her best self. But Queen Catherine's court was known for drinking Welsh beer. So she spent her bounce back in a sewing circle with her girlfriends, talking about God and drinking imported beer. Not my first choice, but they didn't have Netflix and ice cream, so not a bad option. At some point, though, Catherine's ladies were taken away, and Jane was sent to serve along with her sister Elizabeth, her second cousin, Anne Boleyn, who, though not the queen, was acting like the queen. By this point, Henry was done waiting for his first wife to agree to a divorce. He just granted himself a divorce and married his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Jane Seymour had by this point served Queen Catherine and probably on occasion seen Princess Mary, the future Queen Mary I. She then served Queen Anne and probably saw her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, on occasion. I'm trying really hard not to nerd out right now, but she saw Queen Elizabeth as an infant, and she didn't even know at the time how big of a deal that was. She would have been concerned that Elizabeth was a girl. Elizabeth's gender was a disappointment to nearly everyone. Henry had been sure that she would be a boy, and the planned celebrations after her birth were canceled. This would have been when the tension started in the royal family, similarly to the way it had started with the king's first wife, Catherine. It was just moving much faster this time. Henry had been here before with a wife who only had one daughter, and that was unacceptable to him. The following year, Anne was pregnant again, but she miscarried that baby on Christmas Day. In an extremely superstitious world, this was a bad sign, a possible signal from God on Christmas that he did not approve of this marriage, any more than he had approved of his last marriage. But Henry was still up for trying. The next year, she was pregnant again, but she miscarried again, this time a boy. Jane would have been there for these miscarriages and seen the new Queen Anne becoming more and more desperate for a boy. Everyone in the country knew that King Henry didn't count a marriage without sons as a real marriage, and Queen Anne was probably on her last chance. In 1536, when Jane was 25, the 35-year-old queen was pregnant again. 50-year-old former Queen Catherine was off in exile from court. King Henry, like he had always done before, was attempting to avoid the stress in his marriage by engaging in a dalliance with one of her ladies-in-waiting. The lucky lady, in heavy air quotes, was Lady Jane Seymour. This likely wasn't by chance. Here's what was happening behind the scenes. The king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, had mad beef with Queen Anne. Queen Anne was mad at him, and they were kind of fighting over power. They both wanted each other gone. A man working for Cromwell at court was Anne's oldest brother, Edward. The Edward from the family drama of "Is my wife sleeping with my dad?" fame. Cromwell and Edward were scheming together against Queen Anne. And Edward was like, hey, I have a single sister. She's 24, and she lives here at court. And Cromwell was like, let's see if we can distract the king with her. They weren't even very sneaky about it. Cromwell had adjoining rooms with the king because he was his right-hand man. And all of a sudden he was like, hello, employee Edward. Here you go. Have my rooms connected to the king's rooms. And then Edward was like, Jane, hang out at my place as often as possible. Cromwell and his supporters would undermine Queen Anne when they could, talking about her big mouth and her lack of a son or just her bossy woman behavior. It was easy for them. Jane was quieter than Anne. She was kind of the anti-Anne. Jane was kind of just a younger version of Henry's first wife, Catherine, but young enough to still have babies. This can be seen two different ways. Maybe Jane was a very shy, quiet girl who was used as a pawn by men. Or she was in on it. I think she was in on it. She was accentuating her anti-Anne on purpose. She didn't have a husband. Maybe she thought, well, if I have to get married, maybe it can be to the king. At this point in his life, King Henry was in his early 40s and still fairly fit and somewhat fun-loving. And if it didn't work out, her family would have at least been raised in stature. And if she didn't mess up, they would all be overall better off. What could go wrong? When Cromwell set up Summer Progress in 1535, he made sure one of the stops was Wolf Hall, the family home of the Seymours. Jane would have been there doing her job of attending the Queen. But if they were staying at your family home, being hosted by your parents, you probably get a little extra attention or an introduction like, hey, thanks for coming to our home. Did you know one of our daughters came with you? She works for the Queen. So the king noticed Jane, and he flirted with Jane. And once he sent her cash, along with a letter. She was a bit extra when this arrived. When the courtiers showed up with the letter and the cash, which... random, but okay. So he sent her cash and a letter. The sweet, demure Jane dropped to her knees and claimed that all she had was her honor, and she could not accept money as an unmarried woman. But then she added that you can send me cash after I have a husband. Most people seem to think that this indicated that she either wanted to marry Henry, like Anne Boleyn, or at least marry one of his friends and be his mistress, like Anne's sister Mary had done. King Henry was a great husband and boyfriend when he was interested, but not much once he had moved on. He was a heavy love bomber in new relationships, even when he still had a wife. He was, in a way, a serial monogamist. The main problem was that he usually moved on to his next main squeeze before he had officially cut ties with his last relationship. He was never alone. He had started the relationship with his second wife when he was still married to his first wife. But in his soul, he had moved on, and he was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Henry was not so patiently waiting for his pregnant wife Anne to have a boy. And this new hobby that he had was just flirting with Jane Seymour, who was conveniently always around. He even gave her a small locket with a miniature painting of him inside. Queen Anne was feeling the pressure. She was 35 and only had one daughter. Her predecessor, Queen Catherine, had only one daughter, and when it became obvious she was not having any more, she had been discarded. Anne was feeling the end and was just hoping she would have a boy. So she wasn't thrilled when she saw her lady-in-waiting and second cousin Jane opening and closing a locket, looking at it adoringly. Queen Anne demanded to see it, and when she saw her husband's face looking back at her, she was all, no, don't worry about it, Queen. I just love him like a king. Jane was all kinds of innocent, but Queen Anne had been the king's mistress before, and she knew how it started, and she was angry. She ripped the locket off Jane's neck, cutting her fingers in the process. Another reason I think she was in on it. Imagine you're having an emotional affair with your boss's husband. No sex, but inappropriate texts and pics. So then you get to work and you keep looking at your phone at the picture of your boss's husband, so obviously that your boss notices, grabs your phone, and smashes it, injuring herself. Was that an accident? We are down to either she was very, very dumb or kind of clever, because Queen Anne looked like an irrational pregnant woman. Anne was not just going to roll over like Catherine had. She was not going to allow her husband a mistress, even though that had been the custom when his wives were in confinement. Anne's confinement was growing closer. She was quite pregnant at the time. Anne knew how dangerous a royal mistress could be. She had been one herself. Another reason I think Jane was more clever than she's given credit for. Anne and Jane had worked together when they were younger. Jane was playing dumb, and I think Anne knew she wasn't as dumb as she was playing. She was a threat because she was clever. The men, though, they believed she was kind of a country airhead. And she was playing into that. Henry decided he needed a tournament. He participated in this tournament. He was 45, but for the age, he was still young and fit. He was a young 45. And he was having a bit of a midlife crisis and getting sick of his new wife. They had only been married 3 years, but it was not going well. He was trying to get his mojo back. At this tournament, Henry had an accident. He was knocked unconscious for literal hours. He was getting last rites, and people were praying. Pregnant Queen Anne was worried not just for her husband, but for her daughter. If Henry died, they wouldn't know who was in charge of England legally. Princess Elizabeth was next in line, but she was 2 and a girl, and that couldn't be decided until Anne had her baby, because if it was a boy, the boy would be a newborn king. Then there were Queen Catherine and Lady Mary supporters. They could just rise up and kill Anne and her children so that Mary would be the only option left. Anne likely also had people to go apprehend Mary, because if she was in the Tower, she couldn't be a figurehead for the Catholics. But then the king woke up. So, good news? But it wasn't great news. Henry seems to have suffered from some sort of brain trauma. He was unconscious for so long, and when he woke up, his personality was different. He was no longer the fun party guy. He was angry. Real angry, a lot of the time. Only to be made worse, probably, by the wound on his leg that didn't heal for over a decade. He would die with that wound in his leg, and it probably didn't feel great, so while he was already irritable, he also was in physical pain. There was this story when Anne walked in to speak to Henry. She found Jane sitting on her husband's lap, and she was livid. As someone who had regularly been called the king's whore, she was ready. How dare he be so familiar with her lady? What kind of man was he? Well, it seems like he was still the same man that cheated on his first wife with Queen Anne. For pregnant Anne, this would have been very alarming. She didn't want to be banished from court like Queen Catherine had been. Was Jane sleeping with her husband? I don't know. The story was told after the fact, so it may just be a rumor but the woman who wrote it was the lady-in-waiting to the king's daughter, Mary. She wasn't born yet, but her parents had been around court. This woman's father had been the one-time hopeful boyfriend of Jane, Dormer from earlier, the one whose parents were like, nope, not, definitely not. You're going to be an earl, you can't marry this country girl. So it was word on the street, but she was in the loop as far as word on the street goes, so I don't know. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support me at buymeacoffee.com/longlivethequeen. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.